what is the right policy and how can you make the politics work? And it was really combining the two because I think if you've got a really rubbish policy, then it's great to put the communications on, but you're fundamentally then painting lipstick on a pig. And you don't want to be doing that, ideally. What you want to be doing is working out what's the right policies and then working out how you explain why they're the right policies and getting it right.
Okay, well, Russell, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast to chat today.
It's fantastic to be here, Emily. Thank you for inviting me on. I'm really looking forward to our chat.
I thought we'd start off with a little bit of an intro. So, who you are, what you do, and then what drives your passion for transport reform.
Uh, yeah, I kind of try to describe myself, I suppose, as a transport strategist. But I've been in doing them stuff around transport for over 20 years. And my journey is a very unusual one, I suppose, in terms of how I got to where I got to. I became an elected councillor actually in London nearly 20 years ago now. And I ended up becoming the cabinet member at the council for strategic planning and transportation and worked on a whole bunch of fun stuff, new cycling facilities, rolling out the bike hire scheme, which they had in London, doing a whole bunch of placemaking and pedestrianisation of town centres, doing a whole bunch of stuff in helping to sort of get the Northern Line extension funded, which was under my remit as well. So did a whole bunch of stuff, really interesting, got really hooked into transport, I suppose. And then as you do, I met an Australian girl who ended up coming home and we were engaged. And so we decided to move to Australia. And then I ended up becoming the policy director for the Minister for Transport and Infrastructure in New South Wales. So that covers Sydney and surrounding region. And that was a brilliant time because the government had just been re-elected and they'd gone to the election promising to what they called asset recycle the electricity grid assets. And that meant that they were going to get about $20 billion worth of funding, which they had said they would spend on infrastructure, most of which was going to be coming to transport infrastructure. So if you're in the transport portfolio and you've got billions of dollars to spend, it's going to be an exciting time. And it was, we've got lots of metro projects which are still being delivered as a consequence of that. Light rail projects, transformations in the city, in both Sydney, in Newcastle, which is 1,200 kilometres north of Sydney, Parramatta, which is kind of in the centre geographically of Sydney as well. All of those started when I was around, so that was fantastic. And yeah, we did loads of great reforms as well. We did reforms in Uber and point-to-point transport. We did fare reform, improving the fare system, etc. And yeah, and I've done lots of transport stuff ever since. And now I kind of try to tackle interesting transport problems, things that need to be that are really difficult challenges. I kind of specialized in helping people with those ones. And then I write a newsletter and blog, which people are enjoying right now. So yeah, that's me.
I'm glad you mentioned the newsletter. So you've recently penned an article called "Are We Our Own Worst Enemy When Advocating for Better Transport Policies?" Which does raise an very uncomfortable but probably very necessary question for those of us who work in transport. So you write about how transport has become increasingly politicized in that article. Can you unpack what you mean by that and why it might be a problem for long-term progress in transport?
So I think we've ended up in a situation where certain policies have become identified with certain parts of, say, the political spectrum. And that's a problem because in the transport space, and especially the transport infrastructure space, if you were to start up a project now, it's another 10 years before it'll start up and running on services, right? And in a democracy like we live in Australia or lots of other democracies around the world, very few governments had 10 years without an election. So you have an election. Now, if you have a very polarized electorate, what you end up with is if there's a change of government is a complete change of policy. And that means you can see policies that are cancelled. So big projects that people have spent billions of dollars getting up and running. New government comes in, cancels the project at huge expense, and then goes and does different projects or as we're seeing in parts of Canada at the moment, where they were putting in cycle lanes. New government didn't like cycle lanes, and so decided to dig up the cycle lanes.
Yep.
And that is a disaster for planning in transport. And I think part of the reason for this polarization is, yes, there is an element of society is becoming more polarized, but I think also if you have a look at how transport people communicate about their ideas, we're our own worst enemy and are encouraging that polarization.
Back on posts, actually. So in your article, you've outlined that there are 5 key ways that advocates may be getting it wrong when they're coming to transport policy. Can you briefly walk us through what those are and which ones do you think are maybe the most pervasive?
Yeah, I'll start at the top. I think we have a tendency to preach to the choir. So when we are, and lots of transport people are advocates for public transport or walking and cycling, and they have a tendency to only talk to people who also like walking and cycling and public transport. And they don't talk to the people, the vast, in a lot of cities, the vast majority of people who drive. And so that's a problem when you're only talking to a relatively small proportion of the population, or you're only talking to half the population and not the other half. So that's the sort of first challenge. We need to be speaking to everybody and explaining to them about the need for good transport policy. The second problem is we have a language problem in transport. We do not talk a language that the average person, non-transport person, understands. So you see lots of people talking about things like mobility. And when people hear mobility, average person needs mobility, they think wheelchairs. They do not think transport. They do not think public transport and walking and cycling and scooting and etc. And so the language doesn't work. We then talk about things like active transport. And people are like, what's active transport? And it's like, I'm walking and cycling. Oh, I understand now. Yeah, okay. Another favorite of mine, which I heard was vertical transport, which I think was taking it to an extreme. It's like, what the hell is vertical transport? Lifts and escalators. Oh, okay, I understand, right? So you've got a whole bunch of language problems that we use commonly. And so even when you see public documents, they'll talk about, our mobility plan or our active transport plan. Well, that basically means you're communicating with a very small niche of people. You're not talking to the broad public. The third thing I think is we use language that is alienating to groups of the population, particularly people who are drivers. So we talk about them being traffic, not in traffic. We talk about them being suffering from motor normativity. That's not a great way of persuading people for your arguments in terms of what you're trying to achieve by alienating them with that. And as a consequence of that as well, that alienating language is we also have a tendency to talk down to them. So, we're the experts. We know what we're talking about. You don't, we know better than you kind of perspective. And again, that is not helpful when you're trying to explain it to people. And we need to get much better at communicating with those people. And lastly, I think we use the wrong messengers. So we use messengers who are not like the people who we are, those people that we need to reach out to and communicate with, those car drivers. We end up talking, our champions tend to be people who are aggressively using public transport or cyclists, and are advocating for what they use and what they want. They're not they're not coming from messengers who want people who are car drivers, for example, and who also think that these are good policies. And I think there's potential there. So if you take someone like James May, who was on Top Gear, and he's got 20 plus years as a very well-known petrol head with millions of followers around the world. He's a big advocate for cycling in London. He's somebody that car drivers are going to much more listen to about why cycling is actually good for drivers than somebody who is doesn't drive a car and is proud about how they've given up their car, etc. So those are kind of the 5 things I think that we're getting wrong.
I do want to unpack some of those things. So one of them being that the first one you mentioned. So we all love a little bit of confirmation bias. And that's not just in transport.
We do.
So often we aim the advocacy at people that already agree with us because it's a little bit safer. We know they'll then probably continue to agree with us. Is the transport industry maybe guilty of talking to itself too much? And if so, how can we maybe get better at talking to the community and taking them with us when we're making changes in transport?
Yeah, I think we definitely end up talking to ourselves far too much. I think that's where we've ended up with, the language that we've got, which is from us talking to each other. And I think it starts at, you know, academia. So academics often have their own language, but of course they then train the next generation of transport people, whether they're engineers or transport planners, etc. And of course, they then have to imbibe the language that they get from those people. And so they then go into the workplace and they're now using this language, and suddenly it's ubiquitous. And the public are like, "What the hell are you talking about? I don't understand any of this." So I think so part of the reason for the blog was to highlight that this is not what we want to be doing. Actually, we need to be thinking much more clearly about how we are communicating with the public, and who we're talking to, so that we really sort of consciously seek to bring the community together, to come to a consensus on where we want to get to in terms of our vision. Because if we come to a consensus, it makes long-term planning, which is much better for transport than sort of stop-start, much more effective, and that will deliver better outcomes for everyone.
Along the same vein, and kind of more into, I think it was your second or third point around industry jargon. So you mentioned a couple. You've got like what do you call it? Active travel. There's modal shift, induced demand, multimodal integration. All of these kind of things mean something to people in transport, but then often alienate the public. What are some strategies that we might be able to use to make transport conversations more accessible without having to dumb them down?
Yeah, the thing I would say, it's just plain English in lots of ways that non-experts think. And the thing is, it's really easy now, because all you would have to do is like you get a text, right? And you just kind of go put it into one of the AI tools now and just
Yep.
say, turn this into plain English, please, right? And it would actually do it. It would do like it'd probably get you 90% of the way there. So, even if you can't, you just being conscious that it's there. I think at the moment we just have that unconscious problem that we're doing it because it's just become so ubiquitous in our environment. Whereas when we actually get out there and communicate with people who are not in the transport world, then then you recognize that, oh, maybe they were not going to understand what the hell I'm talking about. So let's change what that is. So I think it's the being conscious of it. I think we also need to make sure that we are identifying who our messengers are. You know, the fact is, large swathes of the public these days are very skeptical of experts in a whole range of fields, and transport is no exception to that. They feel that experts don't represent who they are, and so you need to find ways of finding messengers who they will listen to and will respect and feel like they can resonate with.
But it is an interesting question as to whether we think that transport has a bit of a marketing problem.
Oh yes, I it's a really interesting one. I think, it's a mixed bag. So if you take the new metro that opened in Sydney last year,
Love it. Yep.
right? Its PR was fantastic, right? I mean, I played a very small part in that project. It takes an army to deliver these types of projects, not just a village. And it's been transformative in terms of, I think, the reputation of transport. Do I generally think we have a problem in transport? Yes, but there are some really great examples of where that's not the case. I remember I was sitting on the metro just a few weeks after it opened, and there was some people who were just on there just for a trip on the metro because they'd heard so much about it, and they were going, "Oh my god, this is amazing! It's so quick, it's so quiet." They were just loving the whole experience, and it's just been a brilliant piece. And I think over the last, I would say probably like 15 years or so in Sydney, I think there has been a change of perspective and people have become much more positive about public transport generally. And this was just a kind of another turbocharge of that. So, have we got a problem in transport? In places, yes. Especially if we run services poorly, and they're dirty and they're late and they're unreliable. So, yes, we've got a brand new shiny metro, which is going fantastically well in Sydney, but our main train system at the moment has reliability issues. And the state government's getting hammered to try and fix that.
Back to the advocacy piece. How much do you think that effective advocacy just comes down to good communication?
So we used to have a saying when I was in the minister's office, right? Which was, what is the right policy and how can you make the politics work? And it was really combining the two because I think if you've got a really rubbish policy, then it's great to put the communications on, but you're fundamentally then painting lipstick on a pig. And you don't want to be doing that, ideally. What you want to be doing is working out what's the right policies and then working out how you explain why they're the right policies and getting it right. So I would always say start with the foundations, get your foundations right, work out what the right projects are, what the right strategy is, what your right objectives are. And then once you've got those things, you can then work out, okay, how are we going to explain these things to the community so they understand why we're doing these things? So I'll give you an example of a transformation that we did. So when we did the fare reform, and I touched on it earlier, the old fare system had free fares. So you did 8 trips, and then you got free fares. Okay, and we abolished the free fares. Now that's not easy to do, but it was the right answer, and I'll explain why. So we we used to have the fare system had free fares, but it also had a problem in that we were increasingly in Sydney becoming, here's a bit of jargon, multimodal. But it basically meant that people changed from buses to light rail or ferries to light rail or trains to buses, etc. But in the old system, they'd have to pay twice. And that wasn't great for journeys. It was very expensive on the public transport system relatively. So we wanted to make sure that they weren't paying twice, and there was a significant discount on for interchanging between different modes. So what we did was we did a lot of work in explaining the problem to people well before we'd actually got ready to announce any of the fare reform stuff that we're doing. And the free fares had 2 significant problems. One, it was being widely abused, so people would do 8 trips and then abuse the free
Yeah, I
fares
remember.
on air. Okay, so you remember, right?
Yep.
But it was also unfair in terms of equity perspective. So the people who benefited tended to be people who were, Monday to Friday commuters into the CBD, and worked 5 days a week. So that's overwhelmingly male and wealthy men. So there was all sorts of equity issues on that. So when we explained all of we made sure that before we did these changes that we explained all the problems to people, so people understood those. And what we did was while we were working out the new system, we did a lot of work with the public in terms of understanding what was a better system and what they thought was a fairer system. And so we did focus groups to have a look at that. And the community came back and overwhelmingly said the new system, the one we've got now, is definitely fairer. Even though 10% of the population were losing their free trips, 20% were winning, especially because of the network interchange problem, and they would benefit. 70% of people didn't win or lose, but they thought the new system was fairer. And so that's the system we got now. And I think there's a lot of good principles in there about understanding the problem, communicating it well, and then so you're preparing the ground for the change that you're trying to make. And I think that's true when we need to make substantial changes to our transport systems, which we do, because otherwise we're just going to end up with ever worse congestion, ever worse pollution. So we have significant challenges coming. We're experiencing already, and they're going to get worse. So we need to make significant changes. You've got to explain that problem to people in a way that they understand.
One of my favorite little like one-liners is this idea of output versus outcomes, and that people often get those two things confused. So, in your view, do you think that we're still too focused on the output, so the projects, the budgets, the final piece of infrastructure, instead of maybe the outcomes that those projects are aiming to deliver? So, better quality of life, economic productivity, social equity, and maybe how can we reframe the value of transport in terms that matter to both the public and the people that use them, and then the politicians that maybe you're trying to get on side as well?
Um, I have to say, I think this is a really good point. Um, it starts right at the beginning in a sense of we're hooked on projects by money, right? So it needs to be a mega project, and when we've now got hooked on sort of mega projects, and unless you're spending, $10 billion, then your project's not really transformative, etc. Whereas actually, if you look at a lot of the projects we need to do, for example, the cycling network in Sydney is really subpar. And it doesn't need to be a $30 billion, cycling network. It can be done for a fraction of that cost, and will deliver huge amounts of benefits. But we've got kind of addicted to also sort of shiny trains as well. So one of the things we've neglected, I think, in recent years is the bus network. There's been some recent bus review, and we haven't done enough work on, the buses are a workhorse really of the public transport system, and we haven't done enough to support those. So I think there's a whole bunch of stuff in that space, which is absolutely true, that we need to be focusing much more on the outcomes rather than just spending money, and just like, here's what, it's really about translating that into what does it actually mean for people.
When it comes to advocating for better transport policy, why do you think transport professionals like yourself are part of the problem?
Yes, we
You could stop there.
no, 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 no. It's and I why am I part of the problem as well, right? I get sucked into using the language, right? I put out a post recently, and a friend of mine said, "Russell, you use this language, right?" He put it on the comments, and he was absolutely right. I got sucked into using transport language, not the tech speak, rather than actually talking about things that the average person understands. It's become part of our habits, so we've got to do that. And you talk about that confirmation bias. It's really easy to go and talk to people, right? It's much, much harder to go and talk to people who, you know, at least maybe don't agree with us to start with, or at least, at best ambivalent about what we're saying. And if you've told drivers, if the narrative from transport people has been anti-car and anti-drivers, okay, they're immediately going to be on the defensive, right? So you've got a barrier to overcome right from the start. They're not even neutral, right? They're thinking, oh, you're just trying to get me out of my car, etc. But my car is essential and all the rest of it. You've got a whole bunch of work to do to explain to them why, putting a cycle lane in on the road is a better answer than adding an extra lane. You've got to explain to them why that's going to be better for them, and that they're not, and it's going to actually reduce congestion and make it a better outcome for them.
Okay. Well, Russell, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast to chat with me today.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot for your time, Emily. It's great to be on.
To learn more about any of the guests that we have on the Bite Size podcast, you can check out our show notes at compassiot.substack.com. Alternatively, if you'd like to know more about the company that runs this podcast, Compass IoT, you can visit our website, which is compassiot.com.au. Until next time.